Boy, am I excited for game 3 for the 2021 FIDE World Rapid and Blitz tiebreaker. The World Blitz Championship all comes down to this. Remember, at this point, game 3 means it's winner take all. The tiebreak format means both players are guaranteed at least 2 games at the start, regardless of how we get to a 1-1 split, which we did via 2 draws. That means at this point, if a game is decisive, if either player wins this game, they are the 2021 World Blitz champion. You'll note that we have the same opening that was played in game 1 of their tiebreak match. The exact moves have been repeated to this point. So if somehow you did not watch the first video in this epic 3-video tiebreaker series, you should pause right now and back up and see everything that I had to say about the position after the move bishop d5, rook a7. They're casually playing these moves because they've been here before, and it's not until this move, queen c2, that we are in new territory. You're going to want to back up and see what we analyzed after the move d4 that Maxime played in the first game. That was actually the engine's preferred best move, and MBL chose it in game 1, but he decides to switch things up, even for just the practical reasons to throw his opponent off. You see that it has done just that. Jan-Krzysztof Duda now thinking, using his time to make sure he doesn't mess up any particular move orders that Maxime might have in store for him. The structure, of course, is very similar, and of course, the move d4 for white is still a threat, likely to be played very soon. But you really have to think through whatever minor details might have shifted with this move order rather than the more forcing d4 that was played, as we said, in game 1 of their tiebreaker. Jan-Krzysztof is really thinking about how to anticipate the change of the position and ultimately decides to put pressure on the knight. Unfortunately, Maxime was ready for that and punches with d4, immediately putting Jan-Krzysztof back on the think tank. You see the eyebrows are lifted, the gaze is shifted. He's like, wait a second, did I just miscalculate this? Indeed, he realizes he did, because if bishop takes f3, white will take on c5, not take the bishop back on f3. That point forces Duda to take on d4, where after knight takes, the bishop on g4 was a wasted move. In fact, the bishop has to come back to d7, which is the exact type of position we had in the first game, and yet now knight to b5. Ding, ding, ding. For those who have been following all 3 videos, what move did I say white should have played on move 20 in game 1? Rather than knight to b3, it was knight to b5, and Maxime finds this move the second time around. Note that there is one huge difference. The black queen is not on e8. Because of that, the queen actually guards the bishop on f6. So Jan-Krzysztof could have played the move rook a6. That move would have been key to saving his chances. What's funny is after bishop takes b5, instead of rook a6, taking advantage of the fact that he lost the tempo and his queen was still on d8, now he's actually in a position where if you give this to 2 computers, I think 10 times out of 10, white wins. White is already in that dominant of a spot. Why? Because the rook on a7 is completely trapped. You're going to see this move queen to e3 about to be played on the board, and it really highlights the dysfunction of black's position. The rook on a7 is undefended. It can't move to b7 or a8 because of the light square bishop. It can't move to a6 because of the pawn. And the a5 square, well, not really any more useful than the a7 square if you think about it. But the main point is that after the move queen to e3, which is about to be played, white is threatening b4, taking advantage of a double pin. You can't en passant on b3 unless you want to lose your rook on a7 to the rook on a1, and you can't move the knight from c5 unless you want the queen to take the rook. So really taking in how powerful queen e3 is, it forces queen to b8. But putting that queen on a bad square really shows why bishop to c6 is just dominating this position for white. The rook is out of play. The queen doesn't feel good where she stands. All of white's pieces are on optimal squares. So even after this move queen to b6, white is going to be choosing between ways to improve the position. What is your next move to get that rook out from a7? You don't have one. And that really highlights the potential dangers of this position for black in the Ruy Lopez. Rook a to d1 is played with immediate intentions to play the move pawn to e5. The moment files start to open in the center is the moment that the queen and rook on b6 and a7 respectively feel completely out of the game. And this is a real problem for Duda. He's not sure what to do, because even though the theory was followed correctly until this little subtle difference with queen c2, he's really regretting the move order he chose with bishop g4, bishop d7, and he's never able to get that rook and a7 back in the game once he blundered by taking on b5 with the bishop on d7. So there's really, unfortunately, this shows high-level chess at its best, right? Nothing else black can do, right? It was preparation that was good for game 1, even more effective in game 3 just because of a slight move order change for MBL. and now the black rook on f8 can't really help. Putting it on d8 just makes e5 even better because then the d6 pawn is pinned. You can't go to e8 because the bishop on c6 guards it. You can't go to a8 because the bishop on c6 guards it. Going to b8, what are you doing? You're staring into a wall. The bishop on c6 and the pawn on b5 protect each other, and there really isn't anything for black to do. He puts the rook on b8 because what else are you going to do? But what does that do for black's position? Really nothing. White plays e5, and if you imagine d takes e5, queen takes e5, you see how bad a position would get. If that knight ever moves from c5, the rook would come down to d7. White's pieces are just hopping all over. So Duda decides he'll sacrifice a pawn and try to hold the endgame, but MVL has been here before. He knows how to convert an extra pawn, especially when he has a dominant bishop on c6 and well-coordinated rooks. Duda's going to trade on a3 and hope that a single pawn will not prove enough, but this is not a rook ending yet. The bishop on the board means that black's pieces are still very tied down. White can improve the pieces. Usually you want to start by freeing your back rank in a position like this, and that's what Maxime does. Safe measure. This is going to allow him to get jiggy with that rook on f1, bringing it to d1 or even b1 or c1. It's going to be only a matter of time before those two rooks and bishop are coordinated attacking all of black's pieces. The rook on d7 opens up different ideas, including the bishop coming back to d5, which would hit the f7 pawn. Of course, not right away, but you always have to watch out for that when you have pawns on the same color square as your enemy bishop. Bringing the rook to b8 allows rook to b1, which threatens pawn to b6. Duda plays rook c3 to attack the bishop to stop b6, but what does that concede? The a file. Maxime quickly shifts the rook to the a file, now threatening to double rooks along the 7th rank with rook to a7. First bishop to d5 here points out that the b5 pawn can't be taken because the d8 knight would be hanging, but rook a7 is coming next. Probably Duda already just sitting there kicking himself with what move order he chose. Doesn't want to let his emotions show just yet, but we can all sense what's coming. The rooks are now doubled. The f7 pawn is under fire. A very, very difficult position for black to hold. You can't really move any of your pieces. The rook can't leave b8 without d8 hanging. If it moves the b file, the pawn pushes to b6. The rook can't move off of d3 because then the bishop will take f7. And of course, the knight can't move because then the rooks will just take f7. So really, if you just take a moment to appreciate that all of black's pieces are completely dominated by the doubled rooks and the great bishop on d5. Maxime probably could have even started with king f1, king e2 if he wants to attack that rook on the d file. But this move bishop c4 is nice because it shows that he doesn't need to double down on requiring doubled rooks on the 7th rank to win. The knight is still stuck to d8. The rook is still stuck to b8. White's position is still dominant, and b6 exposes that. You can't take the pawn because the white rook would have just won the knight for free. So you have to play knight e6. This allows Maxime to put the pawn on b7, and now you're in a position where your pawn is so far advanced, probably you can finally cash in and convert into a rook ending, something you really don't want to do too early, but here Maxime sees that the position is easily winning with the pawn on b7. Black can't get over to win the pawn in time before the white king will activate and start to pick off black's pawns on the king side. You try to hold the king back with f5. This makes sense, but after h4, any exchange is going to open up the f4 square for the white king. So Duda gains a tempo, finally trades, which means white is threatening king f4, so black comes back to e5. But after king to e3, you're in a bit of a zugzwang. The rook can't really move off b8 without threats like rook to c7 coming in and eventually rook to c8. So Maxime is going to pause for a second before he executes. In fact, he actually takes advantage of the rook leaving b8 by just taking h5, and that's enough for Duda to just resign. Rook c7 would have allowed a repetition, so cashing in and becoming World Blitz champion in the end was as easy as winning a rook endgame, taking a free pawn on h5, and not a lot of emotion showed there from Maxime, given that he just won a World Championship title. But this was an epic match. Obviously, both of these guys made it through a gauntlet of the world's best players there in Warsaw. But ultimately, it was Maxime Vachier-Lagrave who won the 2021 FIDE World Blitz Championship title. And if you haven't seen all 3 videos in this epic World Blitz Championship tiebreaker between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Jan-Krzysztof Duda, it's officially a you problem at this point. I definitely recommend you check out all of them. Of course, you can check out any videos from these Blitz analysis sessions by myself or Danya, and I will see you around on Chess.com.